There is something deeply wrong with the way you've been taught to think about money. You were told that wealth announces itself. You were shown mansions, luxury cars, designer clothes, the theater of success performed for your consumption. And somewhere in your mind, a script was written. This is what power looks like. You internalized it, you believed it, and that belief has been quietly working against you ever since. But here is what no one told you. The people who actually control resources, who move capital, who hold the strings of institutions and industries, they dress like your neighbor. They drive forgettable cars. They eat at ordinary restaurants and complain about the bill. They perform a kind of poverty so convincing that you look right through them. And that invisibility, that is not an accident. It is a 500-year-old strategy. It is Machiavellian design, executed with cold precision. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the first sign that you are about to learn something real. What follows is not motivation. It is not a feel-good framework. It is a surgical examination of power, how it hides, why it hides, and what happens to those who cannot see it. By the end of this, you will never look at a quiet, understated person the same way again. And more importantly, you'll start to question what you have been broadcasting about yourself. Most of the world will never ask this question. They are too busy performing. You are still here, which means you suspect something. Trust that suspicion. From the moment you were born into this culture, you were trained to confuse visibility with value. Think about it carefully. School rewarded those who raised their hands. Social media rewards those who post the most. Business culture worships the personal brand, the hustle, the highlight reel, the public journey from struggle to success, documented in real time for an audience that will either celebrate you or cannibalize you, often both. You were taught that success must be seen to be real, that if no one witnesses your achievement, it barely counts, that ambition needs an audience, and so you perform. You post the new car before the loan clears. You announce the business before the first client pays. You signal upward mobility through every purchase, every caption, every carefully managed image, because somewhere deep in your conditioning, you believe that being perceived as successful is the same as being successful. This is the first trap, and almost no one escapes it. Here is the brutal truth the system never teaches. Visibility is a liability. The moment you show the world what you have handed every predator, every competitor, every tax authority, every envious acquaintance a map to your resources. You have told the world what to take from you. You have made yourself a target and called it success. But look at the truly wealthy, not the influencers, not the reality television version of wealth, the generational kind, the quiet, durable kind. Study them and you will find something that destroys the narrative you were sold. They move in silence. They dress to disappear. They do not explain their decisions. They do not justify their choices to people who cannot affect their outcomes. They have understood something that Niccolò Machiavelli articulated with devastating clarity 5 centuries ago. The prince who is seen can be challenged. The prince who is invisible cannot be touched. The performance of poverty among the powerful is not humility, it is strategy. It is the oldest play in the architecture of power, and you have been on the wrong side of it your entire life. Niccolò Machiavelli did not write for the romantic. He wrote for the ruthless. The Prince is not a philosophical treatise meant for contemplation. It is an operating manual for those who intend to acquire and hold power in a world that constantly tries to strip it from them. And one of his most underestimated doctrines, buried beneath the more famous passages about fear and love, is the principle of dissimulation. Machiavelli observed that the most effective princes were not those who were most powerful, but those who were most unreadable. He wrote that a wise ruler must be a great actor and dissimulator, that appearing to be what you're not is not deception in the moral sense, but strategy in the political sense. The prince, he argued, must learn to wear different masks for different rooms, soft when softness serves him, hard when hardness is required, and crucially, never fully revealing the full scope of his resources, his intentions, or his capabilities. Why? Because information is leverage. When people know what you have, they know what to ask for, what to envy, what to threaten. When people know what you want, they know how to manipulate you. When people know your capabilities, they know exactly how hard they must work to counter you. But the man who cannot be read, who seems to have less than he has, who seems to want less than he wants, who seems weaker than he is, that man operates in an environment of permanent strategic advantage. This is not ancient history. This is the boardroom. This is the negotiation table. This is the social hierarchy of every office, every neighborhood, every family gathering where resources and status are quietly contested. Study the wealthiest families in the world, the old money, the kind accumulated across generations. They send their children to expensive schools, yes, but privately. They travel, yes, but quietly. They own properties across multiple jurisdictions, yes, but the structure is so layered in holding companies and trusts that the connection to their name requires an accountant and an attorney to trace. They have mastered what Machiavelli called strategic obscurity, the art of having without appearing to have. And on the other side of this equation, consider who displays wealth most loudly: the newly rich, the fragile rich, those whose identity depends on the recognition of their status, because without the external confirmation, they are not yet certain it is real. They perform wealth because they are not yet secure in it. The display is a symptom of insecurity, not abundance. Now ask yourself honestly, which pattern does your own behavior most closely resemble? What do you broadcast, and to whom, and why? Write that answer somewhere. Do not just scroll past it. This is the question that separates those who understand what you are watching from those who merely consumed it. There is a figure that Machiavelli admired above almost all others, not for his virtue, not for his morality, but for his strategic genius. Cesare Borgia, who at the height of his power would appear in public without ceremony, would dismiss the expectations of pomp, would allow rivals and subordinates to underestimate the scale of his operations until it was too late for them to do anything about it. History is full of these figures, the ones who were dismissed until they were undeniable, the ones who were underestimated until they were in control. And what they share is not luck, not birth, not even intelligence in the traditional sense. What they share is restraint, the capacity to sit quietly in possession of enormous capability and choose deliberately not to announce it. This is psychologically counterintuitive. The human ego craves acknowledgement. It wants the room to know. It wants the competitor to feel the gap. And that craving, that desperate hunger for recognition, is the exact vulnerability that sophisticated operators exploit every single day. Think about what happens when you reveal ambition too early. People mobilize against you. Allies become competitors. Those who might have helped you become threatened by you. The investor who might have funded you now watches you more carefully. The employer who might have promoted you begins to manage you downward. You have turned potential allies into active obstacles simply by letting them see too much too soon. But the person who appears to want nothing, who seems content with less than they have, who never reveals the full scope of what they are building, that person moves through the world with a frictionless quality that the visible person never achieves. Doors open not because the invisible person pushed, but because no one thought to close them. Machiavelli wrote that the prince must appear merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious, while possessing the inner qualities to be the opposite when necessary. This is not an instruction to be evil. It is an instruction to understand that what people believe about you determines how they behave toward you, and you have far more control over their beliefs than you have been using. There is also a psychological dimension here that modern behavioral science confirms. When you appear to struggle, people underestimate your capabilities, and the underestimated person operates with an asymmetric advantage. They can see the game clearly, while others don't even know they're being played. The underdog positioning is not merely humble. In the hands of a Machiavellian operator, it is the single most effective competitive tool available. This is why you are still here, because somewhere in you there is the recognition that you have been playing with your cards face up, and the house always wins when it can see your hand. So how does this actually work in practice, not as philosophy, as mechanics? The first layer of Machiavellian concealment is what we might call resource opacity. This means deliberately obscuring the full extent of what you have accumulated, financially, intellectually, socially. You do not lie. Lying is fragile. It requires maintenance, and when it collapses, it destroys everything it was built to protect. Instead, you simply do not volunteer. You do not announce. You do not perform. When someone asks how business is going, the answer is never a full account of the position. The answer is calibrated, revealing enough to maintain credibility, withholding enough to maintain strategic depth. The wealthy practice this instinctively. They have learned, often through painful experience, that transparency about resources invites extraction. The friend who knows you have money will borrow it. The government that can see your structure will tax it. The competitor who understands your advantage will move to neutralize it. Resource opacity is not greed, it is protection. It is the financial equivalent of not carrying your entire bank account in your back pocket. The second layer is desire concealment. Machiavelli was obsessed with this. He understood that what you want is where you are most vulnerable. If your opponent knows your objective, they can position themselves between you and it. They can raise the price. They can withdraw the offer at the critical moment. They can use your desire as leverage against you. The person who appears not to need the deal, who can walk away with genuine indifference, holds a negotiating position of extraordinary power. And this is not a tactic. It is a state of being that must be cultivated. The desire must genuinely not control you. You achieve this not by suppressing ambition, but by having so many irons in the fire that no single outcome is existential. The wealthy do not need this particular investment to work. They need one of these investments to work. The scarcity is artificial for the negotiating counterpart. The reality is abundance of options, quietly maintained. The third layer is capability concealment. Never let them see how good you actually are, not because you are afraid of success, but because the moment your full capability is understood, you will be managed accordingly. You will be given exactly as much as your known capability commands, and not a dollar more. But the person whose full capability remains mysterious, they retain a permanent surplus of potential in the eyes of others. They are always suspected of having more to offer, and suspicion of excellence is, paradoxically, more powerful than demonstrated excellence, because it can never be fully accounted for, can never be capped, can never be used against you. These three layers, resource opacity, desire concealment, capability concealment, form what we might call the Machiavellian architecture of stealth power, and when all three operate simultaneously, the result is a person who seems ordinary to the untrained eye and absolutely extraordinary to those who know what they are looking at. The question is, which kind of person have you been, and more urgently, which kind of person do you intend to become? Here is the insight that changes everything, the one most people are not ready to hear. You have not been building power, you have been building an audience. Think about every time you announced something before it was complete, Every struggle you made public, every win you celebrated in a way that required witnesses, every time you explained yourself to people who did not ask and would not benefit, you were not documenting a journey, you were seeking validation. And validation is the most expensive drug on the market because it costs you your strategic position every single time you take a hit. This is the final Machiavellian inversion. The greatest power move is not the display of having arrived, it is the performance of not having left yet. It is the ability to sit inside your momentum, invisible to those who would slow it, untouchable by those who would redirect it, and utterly opaque to those who would use it against you. The man who tells you he is winning is still fighting for your belief. The man who tells you nothing has already won. Viktor Frankl, in a very different context, observed that the last of the human freedoms is the ability to choose one's response in any given set of circumstances. Applied here, you do not have to respond to the world's demand for your story. You do not have to perform your progress. You do not have to explain your silences, justify your distances, or make your ambition legible to those whose approval you no longer need. This is what the truly wealthy understand that the aspirationally wealthy do not. The goal is not to make people believe you are successful. The goal is to be positioned in a way that requires no belief from anyone. And that positioning, structural, psychological, strategic, is built in silence. Silence is not absence, it is accumulation. Think about every hour you have spent managing your image, constructing posts, crafting narratives, defending your decisions to people who have no stake in your outcomes. That is time extracted from actual construction. That is energy poured into a performance that decays the moment the audience stops watching, which they always eventually do. The audience is fickle. The architecture you build in silence, when no one is watching and nothing is at stake but the work itself, that endures. Machiavelli's final lesson for those willing to receive it is this: fortune favors the bold, yes, but fortune protects the invisible. The man who moves without announcement cannot be intercepted. The plan that is never spoken cannot be sabotaged. The desire that is never revealed cannot be leveraged against its owner. And the resources accumulated quietly, structured carefully, defended by opacity, those are the foundations of something real, something that does not require an audience to exist. You have been performing for people who are not your judges. You have been seeking permission from people who have no authority over your outcomes. You have been making yourself legible to a world that would use that legibility to limit you. Now ask yourself one question, the only one that matters after everything you have just heard. What would you stop showing the world starting today if you understood that your silence was not retreat, but strategy? Most people who watch this will nod, feel something move in them, and then open their phone and post about it. A few will not. If you are in the few, you already know what comes next, and you already know not to announce it.